So welcome everyone. My name is Stephanie Richards. I'm an outreach program manager at Place in the UW-Madison School of Education. Excited to be bringing you this Place Exchange series and to welcome Jacob Meyer. Before we dig into his session, Move Your Mood, a few housekeeping bits. Place Exchange, a forum for educators, families, and communities, is hosted by UW-Madison School of Education, Office of Professional Learning and Community Education, known as PLACE. And this session is brought to you also by the Department of Kinesiology. A special thanks to our sponsors, the School of Education Dean's Office and the Mary T. Kellner Teacher Education Center. And thanks to all of you for joining on this Wednesday afternoon. A quick shout out to our upcoming sessions. In addition to Jacob kicking off our fall, we have a few more I'm excited to let you know about. Dr. Brian Burt will be presenting on building pathways in STEM. Luis Columna, a colleague of Jacob's, will be presenting on physical activity for people with disabilities and their caregivers. Dr. Erica Halverson will be sharing about arts education resources, and Lisa Hennessy will bring us a session of demystifying data science. So please join our mailing list if you're interested in knowing more about our upcoming sessions. There's a QR code, and we'll be pasting these links in the chat as we go. All right, a few logistics before we begin. You are all muted upon entry. There may be moments in this session where Jacob might ask you some questions. Feel free to put your responses in the chat or unmute if you're comfortable. His presentation will be about 55 minutes. It will be recorded and shared via our YouTube channel. Link will be pasted in the chat also. We'll have about a 15 to 20-minute Q&A segment following the presentation. That portion of our time today will not be recorded or shared. Throughout the presentation, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and when it comes time to Q&A, we'll be happy to share your questions. Please keep your questions broad and as anonymous as you can. But Jacob will entertain questions that he feels are appropriate to be shared. I'm attempting to turn on closed captioning and AI transcription for accessibility. We'll see if I'm able to do that. And we'll be sharing a version of the slides at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome Jacob Meyer and, is it assistant or associate?
It's okay. It's associate now, but I get to say that, which is kind of fun.
Great. Associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology. We're really excited to bring you this session as a teaser for an upcoming International Motion Impacts Emotion Conference, which will be hosted on UW-Madison's campus in September. If you like what you hear today, we invite you to come dive deeper into the world of exercise and mental health science and practical applications across the fields of education, mental health, medicine, and public health, and more. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jacob. I shall stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. I will do my best to start sharing. So thanks everybody for being here today. And I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. It's an area of personal interest for me. Also, as you'll see, there's a decent amount of work that I've done in this area that I think is really interesting. And given the context and like the situation here for this kind of a talk, I also want to make sure that you guys have some really practical takeaways, so that it's not just off in the cloud somewhere. I feel like exercise research isn't too off in the cloud somewhere typically, but I want to make sure there's some practical stuff. So thanks for coming. I'm in the kinesiology department, but I also work through some affiliations with the Center for Healthy Minds and the Center for Demography of Health and Aging at UW. Often, when you hear a talk from an academic, they tell you about every institution they've ever been at in their lives, and they give you a nice long history of who they are and where they come from. I thought in lieu of that, maybe I would just share what my lab's work really looks at, and then you can sort of see the pieces as we go through them for the rest of the talk. So my lab, I'm the director of the lab, is the Wellbeing and Exercise Laboratory. And our mission is to advance the science of movement and exercise as tools to improve mental health and strengthen treatment. And a lot of the work that we do is in adults with major mental health conditions, but we've also looked at, big picture, looking at how movement influences kids, how movement influences adults, older adults, and different groups. So taking both kind of a psychobiological approach where we look at like how is exercise doing things, what's happening in the body, like what's the physiology of how exercise influences the way that people think and feel, and then also like practically how do we take advantage of the benefits that we can see with exercise in the real world. So hopefully both of those threads will come through at least a little bit here. Here's the plan for today. We're going to talk through 6 different pieces. Just briefly getting us all on the same stage as to how we think about movement, how each of us have experienced the way that movement makes us feel. Get into a little bit of the science behind affect and what that means. Then we'll look specifically at one session of exercise. What happens when somebody exercises once? What happens while they're exercising? What happens after they're exercising? And then we'll try to use that post-exercise window in the best way that we can through some sort of research ideas. And then we'll end with those practical takeaways. So think about the last time that movement changed your mood. So really, everybody do this. Think about, for you, when was the last time you moved and then you ended up thinking differently or feeling differently afterwards? It's quite possible that you are thinking about maybe when you went for a walk and you sort of cleared your mind. You were able to kind of process things and you ended up feeling, like you had kind of mentally and physically worked through things. Or maybe you're thinking about a hard exercise workout in which you were kind of waiting for the end. And then afterwards, you felt a sense of accomplishment or relief or belief in what you had done. And most of us have probably had both of these sorts of experiences. One in which we can sort of think about like a walk that clears our head, that like during the exercise, we get some benefit. And then we probably also have experiences where we can think about, okay, I exercised, maybe it was a hard thing and maybe it wasn't, but after that exercise, it changes the way that I'm thinking and that I'm feeling afterwards. Now, unfortunately, we can't just exercise once and then like we're set psychologically for the rest of our lives. We have to probably engage in a little bit more often than that. But it is important to note that we both have an experience during the exercise. That's important. And we'll talk through what I mean by that's important. And then also after people are done moving, we also have sort of lingering lasting effects that could also be important. And it's also true that the sorts of feelings, emotions, mood states, thoughts, concerns that happen during exercise are different than those that happen after exercise. So during exercise, you probably think about like how hard you're working, maybe how you're breathing, especially if it's an aerobic activity. There might be some discomfort because maybe you're pushing yourself particularly hard, but there might also be enjoyment. It might be something you like doing. You might feel control and autonomy over what you're doing, or you might feel like you're doing something that you have to. And a phrase that often comes up is sort of like, can I keep doing this? Is it the thing I like? And can I keep going? And then if we think about the feelings that people have after exercise, they tend to look a little bit different, right? You're not thinking about effort anymore. You might be thinking about things like, relief that the exercise is over, depending on what it was. But you might also be feeling more energetic. This is a interesting thing that we see consistently is that after exercise, people feel like they have more energy than they had when they started, in general. And that's interesting because most people don't sort of think like, oh, I want to go exercise so I can feel more energetic. But people also feel calm or a sense of purpose or accomplishment. And I think an interesting question here is not can I keep doing this? But like, what can I do now? Or what am I ready for after this? And I think a mistake that we often make, and when we think about the exercise experience, is we think there is like one single feeling related to exercise. Like when I think back to when each of you guys thought back to the last time exercise influenced your mood, you might have thought about a single exercise session or a time when you were active, maybe it was going for a hike or something else, and you pin like one feeling on it. Well, it turns out that we have a lot of different feelings and emotions that happen both in the process of that exercise and then also after the exercise. Um, and they're different, and each of them matter, but somewhat differentially. So that's sort of the setup that we have to think about. And we'll work through talking about like how do people process exercise during it and why is that valuable? And then also like what happens after exercise and how do we incorporate exercise into a more meaningful mood affecting activity. So we're going to get, I think, not too far into the weeds, but a little bit into the weeds here, thinking about affect. So core affect is how you are feeling in the moment, either positively or negatively. And if you look on the left side here, we see either like pleasant or unpleasant. If you just had to rate in the moment right now how you're feeling, you could probably land closer to pleasant, closer to unpleasant, just from a summary feeling of your current emotions and state. We also have a second piece of how we feel, which is sort of the activation piece. So you can be feeling positively or pleasant and really activated, like you've got a lot of energy, maybe you're alert, maybe you're enthusiastic, maybe you're excited about something. But you can also be feeling positively, but not very activated, low arousal or lower activation. So you might be calm or content. I think here, like sitting underneath a blanket reading a book on a winter's day, right? I'm happy and positive, but I'm also not very aroused or activated in that moment. Similarly, on the unpleasant side, you can also see a differentiation here where you can be both
You don't want to rush it.
activated or low activation level while being unpleasant.
You'll do
And
great.
Russell put together this circumplex model of affect that looks across both of these dimensions at the same time. And you can pretty much put yourself somewhere on this circle kind of at any moment. You can say like, oh, how activated or deactivated am I based upon how high or low you are on this, and then also how pleasant or unpleasant I am based upon how much farther to the right or the left you are. You can map a lot of our common emotions, but also feeling states onto this circle. Why am I telling you this? Well, because it's an important way for us to sort of think about the experience people have with anything that they do, but in particular with exercise. And so when people exercise, they start somewhere around here, and then over the course of that exercise session, both their activation and their pleasantness change. And so here we see some data from a project. Each of these lines on the circle are two different exercise sessions. The one that's filled in shows a graded treadmill test. On this one, we're seeing the person starting, sort of relatively positive, medium level of arousal. And then over the course of that exercise test, they increase in their activation, but they also end up decreasing in their pleasantness. I hope many of you have never had to do a maximal exercise test, but they're pretty strenuous and not that enjoyable, which is why we see these people moving to the left. So what these are is that typically they are one way that we assess fitness within the exercise physiology world. And so basically someone's on a treadmill and that the belt on the treadmill speeds up and the incline goes up until the person falls off. And at that moment of falling off, that tells us that that person couldn't have possibly done anymore. And we're able to get an understanding of that person's aerobic capacity. It doesn't work exactly like that. Like you don't just fall off, but that's the general idea. And so as you can see, like people will be increasing, it'll be getting harder and harder and harder and harder and harder until you can't do it anymore. And so that's why we see that departure over to the left, sort of negative affective valence there. But typically what we see when people exercise is the dotted path. And we see here sort of like sharp up and to the right. So if people are going for a self-paced walk, for example, they end up increasing their activation somewhat, but also increasing their valence. So they enjoy it more. And most activities that people participate in voluntarily map to this up and to the right trajectory. So we'll typically see people coming out of exercise more activated and in a better affective state. So if we put this back onto the last slide, we sort of learned about this. We see that in general, this green arrow, this up and to the right is what we end up seeing. And that's useful because we can see like, okay, while people are exercising, they tend to be sort of, especially if it's in a moderate intensity, tend to be leaving at the end in a more activated and more positive state. So one question that we kind of have to get through is how do we measure or understand how people are doing during exercise? One way is by asking that affective question of how good or bad does somebody feel? Just using something as simple as the feeling scale. This just goes from +5 to -5. All of you guys right now could probably say, maybe I'm a +3. Maybe the speaker's not very good and I'm a -3. Who knows exactly what you have to say? You don't have to put it in the chat. It's totally fine. But this is one way for us to estimate someone's affect in the moment. It's pretty quick. It allows us to get a potentially rapidly moving underlying variable that might be happening. That's a feeling. On the other hand, we also look at like how hard the exercise itself actually is. And for that, we use something called the Borg rating of perceived exertion scale. So Gunnar Borg was someone who over the last, well, roughly 50 years ago, developed this scale that looks at how hard people feel like they're working. And it ranges from 6 all the way up to 20. If you've been in a gym or another exercise setting like that, you might have seen scales that look like this, from no exertion at all up to maximal exertion. And you can sort of use a scale like this to say, like, I'm going to work today at a 13 or a 15 or a 17, and that's going to prompt this sort of physiological adaptation, et cetera. And so we tend to use this for how hard someone is working, but that's distinct from how they feel, because sometimes people can be working hard and enjoying it, and sometimes people can be not doing anything at all and not having a very good time. These aren't necessarily perfectly correlated, but there's 2 different ways for us to understand what the stimulus is and then also how people are responding to it. So pulling this together, we've got these 2 different pieces, right? We have people during exercise and people feeling something different after exercise. And those 2 things are distinct, and we're going to walk through them in a second. Responses during exercise typically are increases in pleasantness and increases in activation, although not uniformly. How hard people are working is also distinct from how people feel during the exercise. So these aren't necessarily measuring the same thing, though we'll often think about it like that. Many of you who are thinking back to that recent exercise that you engaged in might have thought, oh, I worked really hard and maybe I didn't love it. Or you might have thought, like, I went for a pleasant walk on the lakeshore path today and man, that was nice. But it wasn't very hard. So sometimes these things, go together and sometimes they don't. All right, so let's look into the details here a little bit. From the research world, what do we see when somebody exercises? What happens? So what I had alluded to with that green arrow that went up and to the right, we see from before to then exercising to afterwards, we see people who typically start in low arousal or lower neutral affect, and post-exercise in high positive activated affect. What we typically see across, this is a meta-analysis across 13,000 people across 150 studies, about a moderate increase in positive activated affect. So people are generally feeling a little bit more positive and a little bit more activated afterwards. But that's like immediately afterwards. That's the during. That's the green gets you to the end. And then the question is, well, what happens afterwards? And afterwards, what we see is within the sort of 30 minutes post, we see pretty broad benefits. So across populations, across age groups, across demographic groups, we see that general mood increases, anxiety symptoms typically decrease, depressive symptoms typically decrease, and roughly in that same low to moderate level of change. And so this is also across a large number of studies and other recent meta-analysis. And although these kind of set the stage for, we see some benefit during and some benefit after across a couple of different spots, I think we want to figure out like, well, what influences those two results? Like how or why do I feel differently sometimes from exercise or from movement, and how or why do I feel differently afterwards? And so I think one thing that's useful, and I think probably a lot of you guys have thought about, is the dose of the exercise, or what it is that people are actually doing. And it turns out that although for cardiovascular health and many other outcomes that are sort of like hard physiological outcomes, for psychological outcomes, harder is not always better, especially during the bout. So during the exercise, when people are doing a moderate intensity exercise, they're more consistently seeing increases in the way that they're feeling, in their feeling scale. As people get to heavy intensity, we see highly individual. Some people have a preference for higher intensity exercise, and then they tend to enjoy it more. Some people don't particularly like high intensity exercise, and so then when they are doing it, they tend to have sort of a dropping off of their pleasantness. And then once we get to sort of the severe, like as we're thinking about that treadmill that's speeding up and getting steeper, as people are at sort of the top of what they can do, that's the severe category, and uniformly that becomes unpleasant. And so if we look at that mapped sort of across time, you can sort of think of increasing levels of intensity on the bottom here on the x-axis across those moderate, heavy, and severe categories. And then we've got two different people represented by those dotted lines. One person, somebody who really sort of enjoys that higher intensity exercise, and then the lower line, someone who doesn't enjoy that middle spot. And what you see is that across moderate intensity exercise, type of exercise most people choose to do if they pick it on their own, pleasure tends to increase, or pleasantness. And then there's variability in that middle spot when it becomes pretty hard and heavy, when people are breathing hard, maybe not able to maintain a conversation. And then once people are at sort of like towards the end of their exercise rope, so to speak, we see a pretty steep decline in how much people are enjoying it. If you've ever had to exercise to the very end of something, typically you don't enjoy it. Maybe you're sprinting to the finish line and like you're really happy when you cross the finish line, but for the 20 meters or 20 yards or 20 steps before you get there, you're probably working pretty hard and maybe not enjoying those steps quite so much. And so I think one thing that's really important is, as we think about this intensity and enjoyment relationship, what is the best intensity for exercise really depends on what you're trying to get from the exercise. So if you want to increase your fitness, there might be times when you need to be working in that heavy or severe range, depending on what the goals are, maybe to increase a 5K time or a 10K time or something. If you need to increase performance, probably also needs to work in that range. But if you're interested in maximizing the experience or how people are enjoying the exercise, or maybe you're interested in them exercising again in the future or wanting to exercise again in the future, then we might optimize in a different way. Maybe the intensity then becomes something more in that moderate to high moderate range, where people are really getting increased pleasure out of it, rather than when we start to see people kind of falling off those affect cliffs as they get into the heavy and severe categories, even if that might be better for their cardiovascular health. What we care about is how they feel, and maybe their likelihood of doing it again. Lighter intensity exercise tends to be a little bit more effective. And I want to put that final point into a little bit more clear details. There's been a good amount of work in this area that tries to look at what predicts if someone is willing to exercise or move again. You can think about this in the context of kids in PE, like what's going to predict if people enjoy participating in PE. You can also think about this in terms of like sports and kids persisting in sports versus dropping out or choosing to do a different activity, or even in adults, like, you know, you and me may be moving and continuing to choose to do that or not continuing to choose to do that. And it turns out that that during exercise affect, or how people are feeling during the exercise, is pretty important for determining how much more people are going to want to do that. So when we're done with an exercise session and we're thinking maybe about the future, our remembered affect of the last time we exercised is associated with how likely we are to do it again. Because we're sort of in that what will exercise feel like next time question. Well, if that's the question, we'll think about, well, what did it feel like last time? And if it turns out last time I didn't really enjoy it because someone was yelling at me, or, you know, I was doing something that was physically demanding and I didn't like that, I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, next time it's probably going to be pretty fun. You'll have a disconnect there. So it turns out that future exercise behavior, do I choose to do it again, is related to how much I enjoy it when I do it. So more pleasant exercise experiences are linked to higher future participation. And one recent study, just from a couple years ago, had one group of people exercise in a way that they were told what to do from the investigators. And then the other group, they just said, exercise however you want to. But make sure that you're sort of like coming up with an exercise that's going to lead to you enjoying it the most. So if you're someone who likes to just walk, go for that. If you're someone who wants to run or work harder or do intervals, go right ahead. But pick whatever it is that you're going to enjoy the most. And across the intervention, what they saw is that the people who were in the group that were told to do whatever they preferred to do had a 77% higher rate of adherence or coming to their sessions, which is a really large, meaningful amount. Typically, you know, even if you're only getting 10% more adherence, that would be meaningful. This is a huge benefit to allowing people to do it how hard or how they want to. I think another point that's sort of affiliated with this is that we can modify those affective responses by both the way the exercise is prescribed. So as we just said there, like telling people what to do versus letting them have autonomy or control in what they're exercising. And then also the environment. You can think about an environment that is maybe conducive to exercise. Maybe it's really bright. Maybe there's other people around who are laughing or having fun. Maybe you're exercising with somebody versus not with somebody. Maybe you're doing it in a situation in which you feel supported. Maybe in a place that like helps teach you the things that you don't know and you feel good about that. That would be an environment that's going to lead to you enjoying those exercise experiences more. Whereas on the flip side, you might think about environments that are not necessarily going to support positive affective enjoyment. You might think about running on a treadmill in the basement in the winter in Wisconsin, for example. There might be a few of us who have tried that and have decided that that's not for us. Or slowly over the winter, that becomes less and less for us. In part, the environment that somebody is in, if it's a dingy overhead light and you're in the basement and it smells kind of musty, that's not going to lead to positive enjoyment. And if we know that the enjoyment of it is going to relate to how likely we are to do it in the future, that other environmental stuff turns out to be kind of important. So the take home here of thinking about the during exercise piece is really thinking about how can we create environments that are going to lead to people enjoying that experience, because that's going to relate to whether or not they're going to come back. And so we understand that feelings during are important, but what about feelings after exercise? That is how you feel when it's over. We just talked about that, you know, maybe going to the finish line of the race, and then how do you feel when that's over? So should we care how you feel in the period of time after that exercise, or is it really just important for us to manipulate the exercise? You know, manipulate's maybe the wrong word, but as an experimental person, that's what I think about. Maybe create an environment that's going to lead to people enjoying it more. Or should we be thinking, on the other hand, about creating a situation that's going to lead to people having a different or more positive experience afterwards? Would that be valuable in any way? So I pulled back up this slide that we had looked at previously thinking about the during exercise components and the after exercise components, the feelings that people more routinely indicate that they're thinking about or having during those two periods of time. And we saw that experience during the movement is important for sort of like the emotional memory or how we think about what that experience was like, which leads to what our future choices will be to some extent. Now, as we look at these things, there's a couple of ways to split them. And I think what's valuable is to think about which of these are positive and which of these are negative. And you could all probably fill this in and take a look at it. But as you look at these, you'll probably notice that all of these after exercise ones are relatively positive feeling states. And the during exercise ones tend to be, some of them might not feel quite as positive or could be negative, like how hard you're breathing, how hard you feel like you're working, maybe discomfort. Can I keep doing this? Whereas after exercise, the feelings tend to be more uniformly positive, which is great. The question is, can we measure that? Are there real measurable feeling states that occur post-exercise? And if there are, and it seems to be consistent and positive in this way, how do we use it? What's the most effective way for us to incorporate that into both regular life, but also maybe into systems and structures that we have? So I'm going to go through and build a couple of the pieces of this post-exercise experience just to show you a little bit of data, and then also think about how we might be able to harness that post-exercise window. So here I'm going to show you some results from a study that I led with women with major depressive disorder, or MDD. And they came in and they did 4 different sessions. They did one session where they rested quietly, sitting on a bike, but not biking, for 30 minutes. That's at the RPE of 6. Or they came in and they worked out at a light, 11, a moderate, 13, or a hard, 15 RPE. And then we looked at their depressed mood state before they did whatever session they did, and then 10 and 30 minutes afterwards to see how important this intensity prescription was for how people were feeling afterwards. Now, you all probably have some ideas about what you think is going to be the most effective. I had ideas, and then I was wrong, which is like the fun part of doing research, because then you don't know exactly what the answer is, and then you got to figure out, like, how do I update what I was thinking? Well, it turns out, here are the results. And you can see the quiet rest, people felt better after just sitting and resting quietly. This is pretty typical. We see this normally. Most of the time, people are feeling a little bit less stressed. They get to sort of process things, even if they're just resting quietly. But it's not a reproducible effect, or you can't just rest. And you don't also get the other benefits. What we see is from each of the exercise conditions, you see increases. The lines are a little bit steeper. We see that at 10 minutes post, any of the exercise conditions was better than the quiet rest condition for the level of depressed mood state. And then at 30 minutes, only the moderate intensity one was still significantly better than the quiet rest. And so from here, we sort of see that like moderate intensity exercise appeared to be the most effective in reducing depressed mood state, but compared to the other ones, they're all sort of at the same spot, right? But they're all appearing to give something better than that quiet rest. So again, this sort of goes back to the during exercise piece. Maybe there's something special about moderate intensity exercise, particularly aerobic exercise. What about other types of exercise? Is the only aerobic exercise that's helpful? I have a student who's working on meta-analysis. That means pulling together lots of different studies and sort of aggregating or averaging out their results to look at acute resistance exercise. So someone goes and they do a lifting session of some type. Maybe it's free weights, maybe it's with machines, maybe it's something else. And then they look at their anxiety from before to after that. And what you see expressed here in the graph is each individual study is a circle. And we see the change from before their exercise to after the exercise in terms of their state anxiety. So if it's a decrease, that means their state anxiety went down. And then the red smooth line shows sort of the average across that, with the pink bars or pink interval showing about sort of how confident we are at any point. And so what we see here is that After a bout of strength training, state anxiety decreases, and maybe all the way up to sort of 3 hours post-exercise. But as you can tell, we don't have a ton of data in that spot, and we've got a lot more information sort of right here. And the clearest dip or improvement in state anxiety appears to be in that kind of 10 to 60-minute window where we've got the most information. All right, aerobic exercise seems to be helpful, and maybe anything is useful, though maybe moderate is more useful. Resistance training is helpful. The subsequent question is, well, how long does this last? How much benefit do we get? Can we just exercise once and then we're good for our life, or does this sort of dissipate over time? And we've done some work to try to figure out, like, how long is this window post-exercise? And so here's a study where we just had people do that moderate intensity session, again, in adults with depression, because we're really interested in trying to figure out what's the right prescription for adults with depression for exercise in terms of how they feel. And in this study, we had people exercise either at a moderate intensity or do a quiet rest session. And we had them fill out a series of questionnaires and do a bunch of other stuff before the exercise, halfway through the 30-minute exercise, right at the end of the exercise, and then again, 25, 50, and 75 minutes later. And what we see here is reductions in depressed mood state across those 75 minutes. And so the black lines are the exercise, the red dotted are the quiet rest. And those stars across above each of those time points shows us that the exercise session was significantly lower in terms of the average depressed mood state level post-exercise compared to the quiet rest at each of those time points. When people have clinical depression, there's sort of two pieces that people typically have. One is that they feel sort of like low and down and depressed. And that's captured in this depressed mood state. And the other major characteristic is that they no longer enjoy activities that they used to enjoy. This is typically called anhedonia. They don't want to pursue activities that they used to like. Even if they did them, they wouldn't like them, or that's the perception. And so anhedonia is related to pleasure, or how much people enjoy particular things. We also asked people to rate their pleasure at each of those time points as well. And again, we're seeing that both during and after exercise, people's pleasure improves. So the question for us became, well, could we have people do something after this that would be helpful? And we were really trying to figure out, could we have people exercise in conjunction with doing therapy? And I'll explain this a little bit more, but what we wanted to think about was, what were the windows with which this might be helpful? And as we look at the section on the left, we see anywhere from during to up to 75 minutes post. And if we look at the part on the right, we see anywhere from during up to 50 minutes post could be helpful. So we'll explore that in a second, but first I want to summarize kind of what we see about the post-exercise response. We see that in general, both in people who are depressed, but also people who are not depressed, improvements in depressed mood state up to 75 minutes post-exercise. We also see those improvements in state anxiety from aerobic, as well as that recent resistance work that one of my students is doing that lasts up to an hour, and maybe even more than that, maybe up to a couple of hours. We see this anhedonia reduction up to 75 minutes. And then we also see, through some other biological work that I didn't show, are increases in sort of people's perception of their readiness to do difficult things, as well as increases in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. That's kind of a complicated protein to think about, but what it essentially is it's a marker of neuroplasticity, or how capable neurons are in terms of either growing and changing their connections, or in just sort of like maintaining their current health. And that's helpful for thinking about how we might make new connections in the brain or elsewhere. And we see that's increased after exercise, maybe not for 75 or 180 minutes, but certainly right afterwards and for a little while afterwards. So the question becomes, what do we do with that? So I'll talk a little bit about our CBT Plus research program that kind of fits into here. So if we could harness that, the acute effects of exercise, what would it be most useful to do post-exercise? And as we were thinking about this, like, what's something that can be difficult to do or to fully engage in, but could be really powerful if it was fully engaged with. And I sort of spilled the beans already a couple of slides ago, but therapy or psychotherapy or cognitive behavioral therapy in our case was what we landed on. One thing that's really difficult in therapy, and as someone who's not a therapist myself, this is just from talking with therapists, is that it can be really hard to get people out of their shell. They might be willing to come and to make it to the visit, but sometimes it can take, in a standard 50-minute therapy session, like 47 of those minutes to get someone really talking. And then you've got 3 minutes to try to cram all of the difficult work into of helping them reorient some thoughts, or maybe help them challenge some of their own assumptions, or even consider new activities that they might do in the future. So the question here is, well, can we use exercise and that time period after exercise in a really positive way to help assist with things like therapy? So that's what the study that we're looking at right now is doing. This is called exercise priming of CBT, or the CBT plus trial or series of trials. And in this study, adults with depression who are seeking treatment, interested in doing therapy, come in, and they're everybody comes in 30 minutes before their therapy session, and they watch a nature documentary. And they either watch a nature documentary while they're sitting, that's called calm CBT, or they watch the nature documentary while they're biking at a moderate intensity. That's the active CBT. And we look at each of these to see how they might influence what happens in that therapy session that they do as soon as they get off the bike. Within 10 minutes of getting off the bike, they're in the therapist's office. What we're really interested in is, does exercise influence things during the therapy that relate to how effective the therapy is going to be? So there's two key things that we look at. The first one is the development of the relationship between the therapist and the client. And it turns out that the stronger bond that those two people make, particularly as perceived by the client, the more likely they are to benefit from that therapy. If someone doesn't really get along with their therapist, they're not very likely to see benefits from going to therapy. But if they have a strong bond and they feel confident in the way that they're interacting, that's going to lead to better overall results. And that's the data that we see here. The active is in the blue, the calm is in the red. And we see across the 8 weekly therapy sessions that in the active group, the bond, the working alliance bond subcomponent, is higher. And this happens by week 2. And we start to see sort of a benefit to having that priming of exercise really early on. I think also a further important point here is that if people are going to drop out of therapy, they do it within those first couple of visits. And if we're creating a stronger bond early on, that might also lead to less dropout. We haven't tested that yet, but it's an idea that we're working on. So one of the ways that we see if people are going to get better from therapy is do they create a stronger bond with their therapist? Another way is, do they actually put what they learned in therapy into practice? In CBT, one of those things is behavioral activation. The B in cognitive behavioral therapy is for behavioral. And so one of the components that happens in CBT is getting people to try to engage more in activities that they used to enjoy, or even just go out and do new experiences, recognizing that there tends to be withdrawal or sort of isolation that can happen with depression. And if people expand sort of their circle or their sphere, that can be helpful. And so the question was, well, do people put it more into practice? Here again, we see active in the blue, calm in the red, and we're seeing higher behavioral activation right again from the beginning in the active compared to the calm group. So maybe this exercise priming is going to lead to both strong relationship with the therapist and better next step of actually doing the things that you might be learning in therapy. Cool. However, the question is, people actually getting any better? Because really, we want to know, like, are they getting better from therapy? And so one way to look at that is what's termed remission. So for remission, in this case, the way that we define that is we look at our people who came in clinically depressed. At the end of the therapy, do they still meet clinical criteria for depression, or do they no longer, are their symptoms low enough that they're below the threshold of clinical depression? And what we saw from our 40-person study was that 69% of people in the active CBT group went into remission, whereas only 33% in the calm group did. That's a crazy difference. And it is for sure a statistical artifact. There is no way that exercise priming is going to be twice as helpful as going through regular therapy. So we should look at the data, but we should also probably think a little bit more about this. If there is even half that much benefit or even a quarter that much benefit, that would be really meaningful. And so here's the graph that kind of helps us see that. Along the bottom, the x-axis, we see each of the 40 people represented by a dot on this graph. And depending on what people's depression severity was at intake, so the farther to the right, the more severe, the farther to the left, the less severe, they're plotted there, and then they're also plotted based upon at the end or the final visit, what their depression symptom severity was like there. And for the Hamilton Rating Scale for depression, the standard depression rating scale that's done by, administered by a clinician, anything below an 8 is remission. And so we see this remission line here. And what you'll notice is that below the remission line, most of those dots are black, meaning they come from the active CBT group. And some, but fewer of the dots are sort of like the pink or peach color, depending on what your computer is showing you color-wise. And so this is like, well, a lot of the dots in the black group got down there. Maybe that's telling us something. But you'll also notice that there's a lot of pink dots that are just right above the remission line. So I don't really think it's this 2-to-1 ratio, but it's likely still to be relatively beneficial, especially if it's maybe bumping people even a little bit lower than they otherwise might be. Even 1 or 2 points on this is meaningful to a person. So this has motivated us to do a 100-person clinical trial. Right now we have 30 people in the study, and we're recruiting and continuing to look at can this replicate when we have a larger group of participants to see if this exercise priming idea, trying to take advantage of that post-exercise window, is really helpful by having people do something that's really hard, like therapy right afterwards. So let's put this post-exercise stuff into context. We see that exercise changes multiple aspects of psychology afterwards. So people are feeling more calm, they're feeling less depressed, better pleasure, more activated, etc. We see this from both aerobic exercise and resistance exercise across different intensities as well. These effects last minutes to maybe up to hours across outcomes, though we don't have a ton of data in that hours window. But as we think about like when should we have people exercise or when should we put PE in the day, we definitely shouldn't put it at the end of the day because we might want to be able to use those post-exercise effects early on. The window post-exercise could be a chance for us to engage in things that might be difficult or demanding. It could be therapy. It could also be tests or other types of activities. Maybe I should have exercised right before this presentation so that I would be in a different mood state than I am right now. I should practice what I preach, really, is the answer. And we have some early promising results for exercise priming to particularly influence or augment therapy. Cool. So what? How is this useful for you? How should we put this into practice? And I think there's some like clean take homes that I want to leave you with so that you have like something to think about, and pick any of these or think about any of these that align with what you might either personally or in the way that you work be able to incorporate some of this information. So I think first off, start easier than your ambition wants. So a lot of times people start exercising or they create an exercise program or maybe even a prescription for others, like in an education setting, that's higher than it needs to be, especially if the goal is people to enjoy it or during or afterwards. Moderate intensity exercise seems to be sort of the sweet spot. And especially if you want someone to do it again next week or next time, or you want to do it again, you want to create a new habit, finding an emotionally enjoyable dose is actually really important. Much more important than how much stronger or faster you're getting from that exercise session. There's 2 pieces to this. We want to both think about those during exercise feelings and not just the after exercise feelings. They're both important, but especially if we want to think about, is someone going to do it again? They typically link what that exercise session was like emotionally to the period of time while they were exercising. not the time afterwards. So we want to think about how do we make that experience, those during exercise feelings, more positive, either through the prescription or through the environment. Pacing is particularly helpful. That one study showed us 77% higher adherence when people got to pick. Most of us do that on our own anyway, but in terms of thinking about like if you're working in an education setting or something else, how do we allow people some of that control in what they're doing? Because that's going to help that person come back next time or next week. I also like to think of exercise as a transition ritual. So I think a lot of us during the pandemic in particular shifted the way that working looked to lots more at-home work and other things. And people lost those commutes in and out, the plugging into and out of work. And I think exercise can be a really useful thing to plug into and out of lots of things. It could be work, but it could be other things. So thinking about a walk, a bike ride, or some short movement as a way to transition into something, especially something that might be difficult, or even to transition out of it, could be helpful. And then let's not think about exercise as magic. Like exercise isn't going to fix everything, right? It's not going to, you know, go back and retake my test and give me an A on it, right? It's not going to fix the relationship problem I'm having. But we might be able to use it, leverage it in a way that could help us to shift the conditions for how we might engage with those things in the future. It might help me process what's going on, even if it's not going to fix, you know, the test that I failed. So I think what is useful to sort of leave the talk with is that exercise is not just something that we recover from, it's something that we carry forward. Even if in that moment it feels really hard and then we got to get over it, it has effects that continue to last. And I think that's important for us to think about, both in terms of the days or minutes afterwards, but also in terms of the accumulation that we might get from regular exercise behavior. So that's the end of the talk. I want to give one brief note to something that Stephanie had led with, thinking about the conference that I'm helping to bring to Madison next month. So the Motion Impacts Emotion Conference is at UW. If you want to, you can scan that QR code with your phone, and that'll take you to the website. There's a number of people on campus who are a part of this. Dane Cook, another professor in the exercise psychology area in kinesiology here at UW, but there's also international experts from Belgium, from Australia, from Canada, from all over, who are going to come and talk about how motion can impact emotion and how we can use that across different settings, maybe refugee or mental health or other situations. So if you have any interest in that, please take a look. And then the final thing is, like, I don't do any of this by myself. It takes a huge team who you can see on the right here, all of whom are awesome and incredible, and the reason why any of this work gets done. And then I want to acknowledge funding, and then significant collaborators. I came from Iowa State 2 years ago, so more of a recent Madisonian, but I grew up here, so it's sort of cheating.
All right. Well, thank you, Jacob, for
I put
such.
my
Oh,
email in the chat. If anyone has a question that they would rather ask off, you know, not here, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to respond.
great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for an informative and engaging presentation. We folks still on the call, we want to hear from you. We want to know what topics are of interest, what days and times work best for these kinds of sessions. So we have a really brief feedback form, QR code on the screen. And I think Eric will put, or maybe I already put the link in the chat. We'll pop it in there again. So please take a moment. We do have an incredible lineup for the rest of this fall and into spring, which I've already mentioned, but I'm really excited to have Dr. Brian Burt talking about pathways and STEM, Luis Columna coming back to talk about exercise for people with disabilities and their caregivers, arts education resources with Dr. Erica Halverson, and demystifying data science with Lisa Hennessy. So please help us spread the word about Place Exchange. It's an opportunity for educators, community members, practitioners to come and learn about the latest research-based practices and to get some practical strategies to implement in your work. And we hope to see you all again at a future place exchange. Thank you so much.